This video is the second part on evolution and is covered well in chapter 24. So in this video, we'll be looking at some of these other key concepts from the subject outline, in particular about when new niches become available for a species, how they might evolve under selection pressures to adapt to that. And we sometimes call that adaptive radiation or divergent evolution. There's also a process of succession about as new niches form, how different populations and communities become established within that ecosystem. And then this also then leads to the discussion of convergent evolution, how similar niches and environments in different locations can provide similar selection pressures, which then push evolution in very similar directions, even in really unrelated species. So when we talk about niche and fit, sometimes I like to think about a puzzle. This is one by MC Escher. And we can see here that there's a whole lot of different organisms that fit together in this puzzle way. And so a niche is about like a hole in the puzzle where a piece might go. So if you imagine this bat not being here, there's a bat-shaped hole, a niche, right in the middle of this community where there'd be a perfect spot for some sort of winged insectivore to live. And so the bat fits this niche really well and provides not only in the puzzle sense a fit for that hole, but in an ecosystem's sense, it's an organism that is well adapted to do what it needs to do in that particular environment and adapts to the food source. So here's an adaptation of a number of different species of birds to particular niches, in this case defined by food sources in an aquatic environment. So the niches here are around the deeper levels of food in the algae that the flamingo can get compared to the insects and invertebrates that might be available for the plovers. And so each of these different birds fulfills a role, finds its ecological niche, and the population over time and generations adapts to accessing that particular food source that provides their niche. And the leg sizes, the buoyancy, the feet shapes, and the beak shapes are all adaptations via natural selection to make use of the food source in that particular niche. So we can see how niches and selection pressures drive adaptation and evolution. But what about getting things started in the first place? What happens right at the start when we create a whole lot of different niches and ecosystems? So often new niches arise from major environmental change. So we can see here some really major examples of that. Here's a new island formation from a volcanic eruption. In particular is the new island that's been formed as part of the Kilauea volcanic activity happening in Hawaii at the moment. This one here, this is ice with some dirt on it, and this is the retreat of a glacier, leaving barren rock behind. Here is after a bushfire, where you have bare earth and a whole lot of dead trees, and this one's pretty catastrophic. This is obviously a meteorite impact crater. But each of these clear away the community, leaving behind the ability for a new community to establish itself and create a new ecosystem. That process is what we refer to as succession. There are two examples of that, primary and secondary. So primary succession goes like this. You might start off with bare rock, and so for instance, the volcanic eruption would lead to formation of a new island that just has bare rock. That's not a very good niche for anything to become established or an ecosystem. But there are some species very early in the pioneer stages, like lichens and moss, that can work on that bare rock, live there. There's some moisture, there's some sunlight, and the lichens can grow very slowly on that rock. No trees can grow at this point because there's no soil. So the early pioneer stages, lichens and moss, as that starts to break down the rock and you get to some sandy sort of soil, some small annual plants can grow, and some insects might come along to pollinate those, and we end up with some organic matter starting to build up. The difference between sand and soil is sand plus organic matter. So that provides us with a soil layer in which bigger plants can grow. As those other plants die, the insects die, or small animals like leave behind feces, and that starts to build up an organic layer and create soil. And so after a few years, we can start to have perennial herbs and grasses growing in that shallow soil layer. And again, this will bring in more birds, more insect species, more mammals, and we start to build an ecosystem. In the intermediate stages, we might have some shrubs and some shade intolerant trees, a few things that are growing in there, some other things, and we get a deeper and deeper soil layer happening. And eventually those might be replaced by these bigger trees, and then the ones that were in the understory before might disappear. And so succession isn't just about building more and more, it's about how each layer replaces the old one as we build up to bigger and bigger trees we see here, but also you have to remember the fauna, the insects, birds, animals will all be a part of this, as well as the microorganisms and the complexity of the decomposers, bacteria, fungi, worms, and things like that in the soil layer as well. So when this starts from bare rock, we call that primary succession, the succession process right from the primary start. But not all forms of destruction or environmental change will get rid of the soil completely. So clearly the glacier sweeping through or the lava turning into rock, we start with bare rock. But if we have a bushfire, that will tend just to burn down the trees, leaving the soil behind. And so processes like that, where we re-establish a community in an ecosystem where there is still some soil there, we call that secondary succession. And other things that might cause that could be floods, for instance, again, wiping away the trees but leaving soil behind. And of course, that's a much faster process, and you're able to establish shrubs and trees more quickly under secondary succession. So when new ecosystems arise, then you might have multiple niches in which organisms can establish themselves and evolve. And one of the key examples of this might be, we could use marsupial mammals as a way of understanding how from initial events of where a new ecosystem comes into effect, that you can see radiation of different species going out in different directions. So in this case, radiation we're talking about here, nothing to do with ultraviolet radiation or nuclear waste. What we're talking about is just radiation lines that are diverging in different directions. So when we look at marsupials, obviously we know that Australia and even Papua New Guinea have a large number of marsupial species. But you may not be aware so much that there are a number of different marsupials and opossums and other things like that in South America as well. In fact, that's where marsupials first evolved. So how did they get from there to Australia? Well, when we look back at this time in the Jurassic period, 160 million years ago, Australia was part of Gondwana, and South America via Antarctica was connected to Australia. And so the early marsupials, the early mammals, were able to migrate into Australia and find a whole lot of new ecosystems and niches in which they could adapt and change. As the continents drifted apart, then Australia became separated as this giant island, and those marsupial species, the early ancestral marsupials that had arrived, were able to adapt to each of the different ecosystems in Australia and find their niche in which they could survive and reproduce. And so what we end up with is some sort of early marsupial ancestor, probably four-legged, and very similar to some sort of small mousy type thing, that then was able to grow in size to become things like the Tasmanian tiger, here listed as Tasmanian wolf or Tasmanian cat, might have got fatter and become the burrowing wombat, climbed into trees to become the koala, or even climbed into trees but then being able to glide like our sugar glider. And of course, a kangaroo being an example, extreme example of one that's become two-footed, as it were, and become hopping. So from an early ancestor mouse-like animal, obviously a marsupial mouse, we now have this range of extant and sadly extinct as well marsupials. And the reason that we have all these different morphologies is that they're each adapted to different environments. Clearly, the sugar glider is adapted to living high in the trees and flying between them. The wombat is adapted to living underground and burrowing, and the kangaroo is adapted to moving quickly across the plains. The Tasmanian tiger adapted as a predator and is therefore a carnivore as well. So we can see from that initial species founder sort of population, we have this radiation out in different directions for lots of different marsupials. But although evolution can go out in different directions, there are also ways in which it can come in, and that's what we refer to as convergent evolution. So divergent going apart, convergent coming together. And the drivers of convergent evolution are that even though we have these different ecosystems across different continents, actually, quite often the situation and the selection pressures are quite the same. So here we have Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa and Mount Fuji in Japan. Very similar kind of climate, environment, and selective pressures that might be driving evolution and natural selection in those areas. Again, here's desert in the US versus desert in Australia. Very similar conditions. And so sometimes evolution will be driven towards very similar designs. Examples of that, here we have some convergent evolution. So we've got 3 placental mammals and 3 marsupial mammals that have very similar roles within their communities, but are not related at all, or at least very distantly related to a common ancestor back before the Jurassic time. So here we have a marsupial mouse and a placental mouse, the Tasmanian tiger or wolf, and a regular wolf, and the sugar glider and the flying squirrel. So because the wolf and the Tasmanian tiger are both carnivores, 4-legged, that designed is the wrong word, they have evolved and adapted over generations to have similar jaws that can bite through flesh, running, the ability to catch prey, all that kind of stuff. But clearly the wolf has pups, and the Tasmanian tiger as a marsupial mammal has a pouch. Similar with the marsupial mouse, a small herbivore living in the bushes is going to look a bit like a mouse, whether it's a placental mouse or a marsupial mouse. Most extreme examples of this are around streamlining for swimming underwater. So we have 4 different classes of animals here that are not related other than very, very distantly back in evolution. Shark clearly is a fish. An ichthyosaur is a reptile, a dinosaur, swimming dinosaur. Dolphin is a mammal, and a penguin is a bird. So very different evolutionary branches, but clearly swimming underwater means you tend to have a very streamlined body that's pointy at the front. And so we can see that on each of these. The pectoral fins are present on each of these, and the wings have evolved into being something very similar to a pectoral fin in the penguin. These 3 at least have a dorsal fin as well. One of the key things that you'll see that helps you to work out whether it's a fish or a mammal is that fish swim by waving their tail this way, and so their tail fin is up and down vertical, whereas dolphins and whales, we call cetaceans, swim by waving their fin up and down like this. And so that's a clear way of seeing the difference between a swimming fish and a swimming mammal. But even though they have that evolved swimming separately, and that's a really key evidence that they've evolved separately in that sense, we can see a lot of similar features. So convergent evolution sometimes means we have matching morphology, even though genetically and phylogenetically they're not related.